Sharon?
Yeah, just gonna see, am I,
You're sharing is all good.
and I'm recording. Okay. Hi, everyone. So today, as per the schedule, they split in half with about an hour lecture first. And again, it's being recorded and you'll get the slides. So keep that in mind with notes, etc. You can just listen, and we might also might want to jump in, have questions, or we can have, yeah. And yeah, we'll take about an hour, and then we'll take a little break, and then later have the afternoon is the first workshop sessions with your asset libraries, which will be done in 3 separate groups. Preparation for next week also. So again, the lecture is what they're about. It's a little bit listed on the base, so you can see when there are lectures and a little bit what they are about. And you maybe would have seen that today's talk is titled from the pattern book to the asset library. A little bit diving a little bit deeper into what we saw at the MUC last week with that history and how we see this kind of continuum into the world that we work in today and your work. And I don't know if I should move the computer so we can do the slides.
I'll tell you next when I
Yeah.
need it. So we can start with just very brief or a selective history of the pattern books. Some of them are the ones that we saw on Thursday at the MAC, but just a little bit of nuance of how this development took place from the 14th, in this case, starting in the 16th century. To give a bit more context, the 14th century, it's marked by the invention of the printing press. Okay, so this is going to be very important for all of this history to develop because the ability to print books with a press means that this information can be distributed in a much faster pace. That's why we are starting to look at it in this moment and not earlier in this case, because we're looking at the methods and the devices that were developed for information to travel. And this becomes very important when we're speaking about aesthetics, and especially when we're speaking about the area of aesthetics that we might understand as a style, which is something that we're going to be touching on heavily today. So a very brief, or as I was saying, a selective history of some of these pattern books that were being developed in Europe, starting with Serlio. Is one of the ones we saw. What is really interesting or significant about Serlio's book on architecture, and specifically the one that is on style, is that it was the first book on architecture in Europe that was actually written in Italian being a lay language, a language that people spoke, as opposed to Latin. Most knowledge back then was recorded in Latin, and that meant that it was only available to people who spoke Latin, which in that case would be only a very selective group of people. So there was not together, let's say a century after the invention of the printing press, there is this intention to create a book that not only can be distributed in greater numbers because of the press, but also is more accessible because of its language. Almost contemporary with that, well, because this was 5 books that happened over a period of 40 years, contemporary with some of the last books of Serlio is Andrea Palladio, the 4 books on architecture. This is probably something that you were taught in architecture history class. And these books are always written with a lot of authority, and the fact that we continue to teach them in history class speaks for the lasting effects of basically putting things on paper and saying the way things are and recording them in a medium that again gets distributed. In this case, were books. So of course, this you would have heard about. It establishes the classical canon of architecture. Okay, so the classical orders, all of that is sort of established in this moment, which is many, like 1,500 years later than it would have been actually when those buildings were being built. So again, it's a reinterpretation that reifies many of these notions, or like the buildings that existed get collected and a history is built around them, which is not necessarily what they were. Jumping quite a bit and skipping in between the 16th century and the early 18th century, skipping some other books that happened in France that I don't know enough about, but they exist. Just in case you find them out as well, they're not here because don't know enough about to talk about them, is the Fischer von Erlach World History of Architecture. So at this moment also, there is an aim to see how we go from looking at ancient Rome and ancient Greece with Serlio and Palladio to now trying to understand the entire history of architecture. There is traveling by colonial powers, in this case, the early steps of some of the colonial empires. And as travel is happening, the people who is going to become art historians, or like at the time, maybe they were not understood as such, but art historians come in these expeditions and they see other architectures, and then they feel like they need to make sense of the world from their perspective. Okay, so here begins the fully fleshed fantasy of what architecture history later becomes. These are always interpretations. This has to do with who gets to tell the story. The English, on their side, are in this moment going through their romantic period. They're building a lot of gardens, and they also are interested in pretty things from their gardens. So we see books like William Chambers' Designs of Chinese Buildings that then that basically creates these fantasies of buildings that he encountered in China. And then not only that, but creates other books where in the next slide, there is, this one. Starts to create these full designs of Chinese gardens. This is called Palais de Hing Kong, where he starts to just basically completely absorb what he's seeing and what he's loving and bringing it back. And that's why we find, if you have visited or if you ever visit London, you find pagodas in a lot of gardens in London, and this only has to do with these people's fancy. Something feels exotic, something feels otherworldly, so they start to sort of virtually travel within their own spaces. Quite a big shift, and here, yes, going to the towards the French, the Durand book on architecture aims to catalog architecture not only into styles but now also into typologies of buildings. Okay, so one could say that up until now they were trying to look at different cultures and the way things look, and like this is how they do how buildings look here, and this is how buildings look over there based on style. But Durand starts to separate them and in a way compare them according to their function. So it goes from palaces to military buildings to government buildings, etc. So these are typological. And here starts also the logic as well of recombination. So if you look at the Durand book, which by the way, most if not all of these books you can find in the website archive.org. If you look at this book, you will see this basically typological plates set for recombination. Moving on to Owen Jones and the Grammar of Ornaments, we see, well, I think one of the books that you spent the most time with, which was meant more as an inspirational book, a book that he was really trying to truthfully capture some of these details. So in a sense, Owen Jones was perhaps trying to be a little bit more objective, but his intention was that this book would serve as inspiration for people to design new things. Because of the way that this is laid out, and because it follows so much the logic of industrialism, like here are these resources, what happened is that became a catalog, just another catalog for its use, rather than that inspiring book that he was aiming for. And I mean, this has to do with also the factor that he was cataloging, he was already like putting things into slots, which I think was probably, in a sense, his mistake. Into other even more fantastical books, like the polychromatic ornaments, Auguste Racinet, which we were also looking at on Thursday. You see a similar attempt to what Owen Jones was doing, but with a bit more fantasy embedded in it. And at this moment in time, these developments are parallel and possibly have inspired the world fairs. Okay, so we will now in the lecture go more in depth, but I wanted to end with the World Fair because it's like it's a continuous line from the book to the fair. And the World Fair, as we were mentioning the other day, becomes almost like a television experience. You can change channel and move from one place to another. And the way they were conceived also was very much centered in industrial logics. No? They were displaying techniques and from across the world that could be absorbed and could be adapted. And we see these world fairs happening over not such a long period of time, over half a century, across many different parts of the world. To conclude on this, it's important to mention what was happening specifically in Germany. And you might have encountered Alois Riegel. I think Tulay probably would have mentioned him, who then write the problem of style, foundations for a history of ornament. And in this case, again, we have gone from histories of architecture to specific histories of ornament or the decorative arts, as it would have been understood back then. And Alois Riegel tries to, proposes this notion that the history of ornament is continuous at a global scale. So he has a series of cases, one of them being he goes through 4 types of ornament. One is the arabesque, another one is, for example, the lotus. And he claims that all cultures have used, for example, that all ornaments, or all cultures have ornaments that can be traced back to the lotus. And he tries to make a point on this unbreakable continuity. And his point is very different it's very different from the mentality that there was up until the moment, where the theories that were being put forward was that ornament is the direct product of materials that are available and techniques that are available. Okay, so from certain techniques lead to certain geometries, which lead to certain ornaments. And I mean, this is all guesswork. No, it can be more or less proven, or not proven, but can be more or less convincing. But these are all attempts. And if you look into Alois Riegel, you will find the difference between Riegel and Semper, and that you might read that Riegel was against Semper, but Riegel was more against basically what the followers of Semper continue to perpetuate, which was a much more rigid notion that that ornament comes from material, and therefore material and technique lead to certain types of ornaments. So we are going to move in the lecture from speaking about aesthetics to speaking about style. And these terms are probably going to take you a long time to understand. Here are some definitions that might help you, but aesthetics is basically how we perceive the world, how things look like. And the point that we try to make, and why we use the word aesthetics, is because the way a thing looks like to you is processed through your brain, which contains different things than mine. So the way things are perceived means also the way things are sensed and valued, and that is informed very much by your experience. So feelings, judgments, and cultural meaning is assigned as we perceive something. And all of that package is your aesthetic experience of something. Okay. We are gonna go to, we could say an area, if you go back 1 second, an area of aesthetics. That is what we're going to refer to as a style. And that is maybe easier to understand, and that's why we have reduced that in this lecture. A style is a pattern, okay? A pattern is anything that is repeatable, and sometimes the thing that we repeat can have variation, But if we can identify it as a group that belongs all together, that means that we are perceiving a pattern. Our brain is very happy with pattern recognition. We are constantly looking for things we know. We are constantly looking for shortcuts, not consciously, completely unconsciously. Whether we want it or not, we are doing that. So style is the patterns through which aesthetic languages are recognized and cataloged. And this is where we go back to why were they doing these pattern books? For many reasons. A lot of them came from the whole mentality of colonial powers, but also because they were satisfying the willingness of the brain to synthesize things, to put things together. I want to create an encyclopedia of world architecture because it helps me. It helps me better synthesize the wealth and the complexity of architecture across the many, many cultures in the world.
And obviously this question specifically in architecture is a complex one. In many ways, you can look at graphics or something more simple and talk about style in a slightly more approachable way when things are two-dimensional. It doesn't mean that they have less meaning, but obviously if you talk about style in architecture, not only are you talking about potentially thousands of years of different parts of the world, and specifically what Lara is talking about, but who writes the way that we are then interpreting the world based on those styles and what they mean and what they didn't mean. It's extremely complex. And many would argue that to talk about style in architecture at all diminishes what architecture is meant to be. Obviously, we argue through this semester that is just avoiding the problem and not engaging with what it actually means. But it's also interesting just to give a kind of broad perspective on kind of what style is becoming to our time, us as audiences of media, of entertainment, and the increasing amount of cinema and graphic novels and video games that is using styles of entire worlds, like this amazing example of this animated film from a few years ago that uses Spider-Man story, but there are different Spider-Mans from different universes, completely different graphic style, different values, different aesthetics, and they all kind of coexist, which we argue is a kind of storytelling that you don't really see before the past 10 years. So somehow the media that we're consuming, other examples where like the graphic style in these movies are constantly shifting and this idea of multiverses, etc. And we argue that this is linked to the way we think about style in our work. And obviously, as architects, this is also extremely relevant.
You could see in those clips that the way worlds are represented is through graphic styles that eventually also seep into the style of the worlds themselves and their architecture and all the things within them.
And this text that we wrote a few years ago is in the brief, and we're not going to be going through it, but just a little bit of a perspective again on kind of how we think about this. But again,
and that text is before the AI tools became available. So it's also written, I think, it's very positive. I think we're much more scared now. But,
yeah. So again, just going back again a bit to Serlio, which obviously comes up again and again as an extremely, in the European context, such an extremely important book. Little bit of a brief overview, as we mentioned before, just to kind of give a sense for how messy it was to make a media object like this at the time. It's actually book number 4, but it was published first. The last book was published in 94. Like just for how like manuscripts of this time, getting a book made, getting it distributed, extremely, extremely messy. And it's because it's the first one, the one with the biggest influence and the one that we constantly talk about. And just also give a little bit of perspective on kind of, now this is a map of Europe at the time. Just, we mentioned it before, but just try to recreate as much empathy as you can for when these things were made. What it must have been like to see a book to begin with. I mean, most people had never really seen paper outside of a Bible in your church, potentially. But so when these books arrived, it would have been in a time where if you lived here, your chances to go there, you would be in the 0.000% of the population that had the opportunity to leave your country unless you were colonial sailor or something like this. Most people experienced only the environment immediately around them, that they could walk basically or reach with a horse ride. One very interesting and important book by a former Angewandte professor, Mario Carpo, a book from the mid-90s, Architecture in the Age of Printing, speaks specifically about Serlio and this time when this book speaks about a style that is the first architectural style that's really meant to be imitated, where the media object is somehow the point, and every building is like a kind of avatar of that book, and then increasingly other books. And of course, also he speaks very clearly about this notion that buildings could not travel, so people had to, like, in order to experience buildings, if you were an architect, if you're working with buildings somehow, you had to bring your body and your senses to that building to experience it in any way or shape or form. Or someone could tell you an elaborate story if you were lucky. So then obviously the printing press as a machine itself is extremely important, and it gets replicated, and more printing press gets set up. But in this way, the book becomes like a vehicle for ideas about buildings to travel in. And I think this is really interesting to think about if you think of, so what is the next medium after that? And then obviously what mediums do we have today for ideas about buildings to travel in? We focus a lot talking about ornamentation or style or decorative arts, but obviously ideas about architecture is not only that, right? So like how our ideas of what architecture is, no matter what type of style you're working with, how it reaches you is maybe an increasingly important thing to consider and think about. And we looked at these examples before. You would have seen the original first edition last week. And it's also important and interesting to think about, like, in this case, Erlacher did not go to China. So this was somehow maybe from a sketch from someone else. God knows how he would have guessed what this building looked like. Also did this fold-out plate of Palmyra. Again, he never went. He went to Rome, Naples, and Venice. That's all that he experienced in one-to-one. Everything else in that book is somehow a mediated guess from a story or someone else's sketch, or maybe even in this case, or in the case of the Chinese plate, maybe what you would see drawn on a ceramic ware, like a plate or something like this. Obviously, this is also interesting. I didn't actually know until we saw the first copy that there's a plate of Palmyra. We looked at this example the other day. Somehow the guesswork continues. I would highly doubt that the person who made this asset pack has been to Palmyra or really cares what it actually is.
And the ones who have, which we should talk about another time, is Factum Marte, who are the ones who have the only, the parts of Palmyra only exist now on the Factum Marte's 3D scans, and they have also made a reconstruction. So some of these things, only survive as point clouds.
And we'll just go a little bit in detail in some of these snapshots. Again, they're snapshots in a vast history, even if we are mainly obviously looking from European perspective, but you would have heard about Semper, you would have been to the Semper depot maybe and seen Semper buildings in Vienna or in Germany. Maybe you would have even read this book or seen it. But he wrote this book, and which had incredible impact. He wrote 2 books where he, in these books, were arguing, as Lara was just mentioning, that the fabrication of the material of how buildings are made is how the ornamentation or the style is linked. He had several pages where he's looking at knots, because his big argument was that the origin of all architecture is textiles. The first buildings were somehow made out of textile, and all ornamentation has links to the way that knots were originally made. And obviously, you probably would have heard also about this primitive hut analogy that comes up again and again. In some cases, to talk about the origin of architecture. In other cases, to speak about the romantic idea of a small shelter or follies, etc. There's some quotes from this book that puts it in perspective for how problematic it is, because he constantly talks about the childhood of mankind or the childhood of civilization. And he then doesn't just put like a time where this was the only kind of architecture was around, but places where still this is done today, they are in the childhood of civilization, and they will eventually reach our time and be fully civilized. That's the perspective, basically, that anyone that we will talk about today, they sit in a place where they think that they are in the highest seat, and people will slowly reach that point.
To add to those problems, Semper, and specifically this book, becomes kind of the handbook for modernism as well, right? So a lot of the beliefs of modern architecture come from those ideas that even like saying civilization is uncomfortable, no? That like a civilization has not matured enough until they reach this point. Hugely, hugely problematic. I mean, hugely wrong.
And Semper introduces a few ideas that seems bizarre that they would be so revolutionary, but this idea of Wand and Gewand, like wall and dressing or garment or face or mask, seems today very logical. If we think about the building, like somewhere inside is the skeleton or the core of a building, and everything outside that we see is somehow the skin, like anamelian panning or paint or whatever it is. But it was a revolutionary idea. If you think of like a Gothic cathedral, it doesn't really have a skin per se. What you see is what the structure is, right? And obviously this also branches ideologically in architecture. A lot of people would say that anything you put on the structure is extra stuff and you shouldn't put it there. Sort of modernist idea. Semper was celebrating this and making these links to these earlier ideas of buildings that would have some simple wooden structure, and then the textiles is what you see, it's what you experience, it's what your body is touching. And he took this further, and this kind of created this whole discussion that we spoke about last week also about the polychromy debate, because he was one of the people that went to Greece and through whatever modern techniques they had, could somehow prove that Greek buildings actually look like this. And it further to him proved this idea that the building that you see is not necessarily what the building is. And we should not then try to remove that, but to celebrate that, and that quality is somehow what defines culture, etc. Just a side note, you probably would have been to this building, the Semper Depot here, which is actually built as a storage and a workshop for opera stage equipment, which is a kind of funny link to obviously what we're doing here. But this, we looked at this before also, this new knowledge of different styles created this sense of we want to organize things, and maybe we can build in all these different styles if we have somehow proof of what buildings looked like thousands of years ago in Egypt. Maybe we could build like that, and people actually did. You know, there's Egyptian buildings all over England. There were buildings of different styles. Many buildings even had one style in the front, a different side in the back, which created this huge style crisis. And it then, not surprisingly, created backlashes, which, I mean, we would argue that these backlashes, they happen again and again and again and again. And I'm sure even within your lifetime, certainly within the time that we have been practicing, we've seen probably 2 small or 3 revolutions even, where architecture again becomes very expressive and people uses color. And then no, someone comes and say, no, buildings need to be scaled back, just using whatever material you can afford, and don't paint them, don't cover them in any way. And this is very well shown through the writings and the work of Augustus Pugin that we spoke about previously. This is his sketch of like the ideal world where Christianity reigns and architecture needs to be long and reach towards the heaven, and anything that is rounded, baroque, or anything else is somehow feminine. It's about sex, which we shouldn't even talk about, and it's about crime, etc., etc. He created these books, again, hilarious because he was against books and against distributing ideas in this way. But looking at history of fortification, and again, ignoring the last 300-400 years of architectural history, and looking back to the Gothic time, the high time of Christianity in Europe, as this sort of magical ideal. But this is the sort of environments that he designed. The interior of House of Parliament in London is probably his most famous work. And it's interesting connecting to what we did for those who remember a year ago when we were talking about debating spaces and political spaces, because this was one of the first political buildings. That's a modern political building, had plumbing, had heating, etc., where the ornamentation carried morale and an idea for how you should behave. So this sort of Gothic ornaments were meant to make people remember that they were good Christians and they should follow Christian values, etc. Obviously, complete nonsense for more than like 10 or 15 minutes. Also interesting that he actually died from this project. Like the manicness of this work and designing all of this. I mean, this is one tiny corner of the building. He died very young, and people say he died because he overworked himself doing this project. But at the same time as this moralistic work is happening, and this is just to put into perspective a little bit how, like, whenever you hear someone talking about some moral idea of architecture, no one would say, I have a moral idea of architecture, and I will tell you. You know, a lot of ideas about architecture have morals imbued in them, as it's about structures, material. But at the very same time, this was happening. Who has been here? Some people. Yeah, it's like a kind of pilgrimage for architects, certainly, but it also has...
Not for architects.
Yeah.
The opposite.
Yeah, maybe that's true. Yeah, I mean, like, it's extremely popular for people to go because it's one of the most famous buildings in the world. And often one thing that's surprising when you look at it is just how new this building is. It's just a little bit over 100 years old, but it looks like it's a castle from early medieval times or something like this. And obviously, probably a lot of you will also know this link between this building and things like the Disney castle. And we're just going to tell a little side story, which kind of puts things into perspective a little bit on this kind of history and idea of style and architecture. Because the person who commissioned this building was a Bavarian king, and his biggest hobby in life was opera and stage performance, and specifically Wagner. Wagner being a big romantic composer and writing about these medieval heroes, which then tied into nationalism, later into Nazi Germany, etc. But this King Ludwig II, wanted to commission a big palace for him. And his inspiration then through the Wagner operas was this kind of old German medieval palaces that had been built upon several times. They may have turrets and different things like this. But in order to do it the way he wanted, he wouldn't hire like a defense architect or something like this. He hired other examples, of this kind of buildings that he would have seen pictures or drawings of, like the Alcázar of Segovia. But in order to do this, he hired not an architect, but an opera stage designer, someone who had designed stages for Wagner operas. And this is literally the paintings that was then all handed over to the architects. Like, I wanted to look like this from my father's palace, which is on the other side. And he didn't really care what it looked like from any other angle than these key, amazing, iconic views. I could say that he succeeded. The work of this Christian Jank, he did this sort of like big opera stages, but also very romantic. But then we see very direct links to in background paintings in Disney movies. And there's a very interesting link here with putting things into perspective, because Walt Disney went with his brother on a big European tour in 1935. This is him in Paris, I think. And he actually visited this building in 1935. And it's just interesting to put it in perspective how these styles and ideologies kind of merged and mixed, because obviously then he went back, started making movies. Some of the movies came out in the 1930s, the early ones like Snow White, but then he built obviously the first Disneyland in the 1950s, which was basically almost a direct inspiration from this Neuschwansteig. And it's just, to put it into perspective, basically this building, when he saw it, it was the same age as the Pompidou Center is from our time today. Just how things get smashed together at this time, and just putting it in perspective. And then obviously now we live with this iconic idea of Disney Castle, again, which itself is very old already. Actually, the Disney Castle is older to us than Neuschwansteig would have been to Walt Disney himself.
Still there, but there is sometimes that are the same,
Yeah.
and they are short.
We spoke about Owen Jones a lot already. We've seen the books, and we've also spoken about the fact how this work and the kind of work of how it was linked with these artists and designers, but also linked to the colonial powers of empire, in this case, Britain, who, for the building of the Egyptian courts, would have gone to Egypt, taken loads of Egyptian columns, brought them back to the UK, put them back into this TV of the day, the Crystal Palace, where also, as Lara was mentioning, like just look at a floor plan of it. We're not going to be going through it, but it had these wings of different parts of the world, but also of different styles or different elements or different fabrication techniques, which then created, like here we have elements of the Rocaille, which is the ornamental kind of archetype of Rococo architecture, that at this time, through the fabrication techniques that started to be possible, something you could buy from a catalog. Like if you like this over your mantelpiece, you wouldn't necessarily need to find a craftsman who knew how to make the rocaille, but you could just get someone who had a factory who could make either plaster copies or metal copies cast from some palace somewhere else.
Okay, so then just a quick note on this period that Owen Jones is sort of looking at. So thinking about style then, so this is just a reference for the next slide, but it's a painting called The Snake Charmer from the late 1860s, which then in the next slide Edward Said writes this book called Ornamentalism. Orientalism. Orientalism. And he uses that as a cover, right, to match the sort of side. So Edward Said is a professor of literature, Palestinian America, and he was based in the US. And he wrote this book as a critique of Oriental studies. So he's looking at the English, the French, and the American sort of approaches, the scholars' approaches to this creation of Orientalism at the moment. And he's specifically covering the 18th century, the late 18th century, although as the books we were looking at, the idea of the Orient was already popular in the late Gothic period, but Edward Said is looking at this late 18th century period. And so this idea of the Orient then is the geographic region of Southwest Asia and North Africa, so what is referred to as the Middle East. And so these were the sort of notions that were brought to those regions from the sort of Western Europe and the US or the Americas at the time. So he's looking at, so the book basically summarizes 3 main points, which I'll share with you, and then we can get into the details later on throughout the semester or if they come up in your works. So basically, the first sort of factor of the book is that the work of the study of the Orient, it's not an objective work, that this was sort of provided as a basis to enable expansion of the empire, right? So it was not that this is just looking at ornament or ideas for sort of how to do art pieces or art movements or in this sort of neutral way, that this was developing into a way to expand into these sort of geographic regions. So what that means then is that it directly served the taking over of lands and many different aspects of life, you know, extraction and all these different things through trade, all of those things. The second point he makes is that Orientalism is used by the Western sort of, by Western Europe to create an image of themselves. So what that means is that by othering those who are different, specifically in these regions, they're able to see themselves as progressive. So the West sees the Orient, the people of the Orient, which they're talking about Arabs or Indians, and the sort of what they call the Islamic world, as somehow backward, not just culturally and intellectually, but in their political sort of capabilities as well. So they create this sort of superiority of themselves through this othering of what they call the Orient then. And then the third point he makes is obviously that this creates a false image of what this Orient is, right? And that it also essentializes that this entire region is one Islamic society, right? So then this translates to like Islamic art and Islamic architecture. So he shows the problematics of then how this gets used as well. So this critique, it becomes a really foundational work of understanding how Orientalism is used in colonial structures, right? And so then if we go on to the next slide, just for a moment, there's this art historian called Linda Nochlin. This is a suggested reading, but not a required reading. But if you're interested, you may. But she writes this chapter called The Imaginary Orient in this book called The Politics of Vision. And then I'll just end quickly if we go back to the painting on the first slide. So she says that this painting, it has all the trope of the style of the Orient, right? So we were talking about style, and you can start seeing these patterns being used. And what she says is that it sort of offers all the tropes, including, and this is kind of important, what we can build on later, is that there's an absence of history. And then what this means is that the sort of so-called Oriental world was seen as sort of unchanging and remaining in its state, right? Unable to progress or evolve. And that was the view, the Western European and US view, at that time, American colonial view of the Orient, right? That they're unable to progress, that they are sort of fixed in time. And so this painting also sort of, obviously that gets into a different region of how art history works. And like Lara was saying, these things are sort of interpretations and guesses and all, right? So that's how art history is written as well. And then patterns are produced and reproduced. So basically, she says that it goes as far as to suggest that this sort of Oriental world is without change, and I'll quote now, offering a world of timelessness. So as if this could not be outside of it. It could not be in the time that the Western world was quickly or sometimes slowly evolving in a different way. So this was somehow frozen in time as the West moved forward. So this painting then becomes the cover of Edward Said's book. He chooses it. So just to show that relationship of the sort of reusing of this imagery as well. So then go back to Edward Said then, just quick note. So he says that defining Orientalism in Western literature for him was to show that it's a mode for defining the cultural sort of inferiority of the Islamic Orient. So that's what he's saying was a purpose, one of the purposes of seeing this specific region, that the Orient was used as a way to show its inferiority and thus sort of allow this sort of taking of culture and sort of space and all the worlds. And so this was a perspective that a lot of the patterns are coming from sometimes. So I just wanted to share that context. So when you're looking at it, you know where it's coming from, and you can think with it differently without reproducing those views, right? So when you're looking at it, you know why it's being called the Oriental from the time. But when you're using it, you would use it differently with this awareness. Because then if we go back to Linda Nochlin, she says, you can't look at any of these works without understanding the power structure, right? And then you have to take that into incorporation when you're viewing these works, whether it's artworks or the written works. But I think it's good to create that awareness of how you then approach this. And as we get into the more complexity of your works, we can talk more about the specifics that your works are addressing or not, but that we shouldn't shy away from it because it's like, oh, taboo, we shouldn't say that word, you know? But just how do we address it now? right? To rethink it.
And coming back to these pattern books and things that we've been talking about, obviously there is also, we're not going to be talking more in great detail about this, but you probably would have found if you Googled pattern books or things like this, a lot of the pattern books like this one is a Swedish one that just was partially commissioned by the state to try to put together a guide for how people could build their own houses in a country that at the time was very poor. Like the knowledge for how to build a modern building that looked in a certain way. Like this would have been written in a place, published in a place to build buildings in that place.
You will see also in other parts in the world where you will see also scrolls that were written as really instruction manuals that enabled a lot of people to be able to build. So this is why we say like these books are both enabling and extractive. And we are always going to have to hold that ambiguity. And it's very hard to say this is right and this is wrong. But then some things go to extremes. So this is so that the catalogs are basically a form of building up these libraries of samples, which helps us discern the essence of a style. It's very misleading that we're using the word essence here, because usually essence, we think that it's the truth. No, but styles are not true. They are perceptions of patterns. So we used it on purpose to be able to speak about the word essence, you know, and that the essence of a style doesn't need to be that we're getting anything close to a specific objective truth, but that the subjective perception of a pattern of things, we can distill an essence by creating collections around it. And this is a little bit of the exercise that you are doing. A few points on style. Architecture just cannot escape having a style because pattern recognition is a reflex. We are relating things, whether we want it or not. So even if you're trying to be an architect that has no style or whatever, sometimes people things architects say, it's impossible. You are gonna fall into some category at some point.
Which is often why you hear architects saying that styles is useless to talk about. Usually, not always, but that is usually a defense mechanism to like, do not interpret my work as style because it's very uncomfortable.
I don't like it, yeah. Style can only be retroactive, so we can only understand it as after it has happened or after it has been happening for a little bit. Okay.
Which is also why I think coming back to the earlier slides of the Spider-Man movie, like many of those styles are just 10 years old or even 5 years old.
But now they have become language.
Mm.
So this is quite interesting as well, things to start thinking about. A style is formed by samples. Sorry, that's the wrong one. There, I think we had a little point about quantity. So quantity is important. The more you have, the more crystallized this language becomes. It is dependent on media, whether that media is like books from the 14th century or Pinterest. Access, and the faster the access, the earlier we can see a style. Here it can be language. And the meaning of a style is not fixed. Meaning changes. Okay, so we cannot rely on stable style. For these and other reasons, we did a research project. Again, back in 2020, so many things I feel have changed. That is called Freestyle, and we're gonna just fly through this project.
So we would have maybe mentioned this in some lectures last year, but it's very relevant to both what we come from and what you're doing in the studio. Obviously, the title Freestyle is a kind of play that like style is or should be free, but also a freestyle that you can do any style you want. The project, let's say, an archival research-based project that looked at the relationship between style in British architecture and the evolution of media over a period of 500 years. And our hypothesis was that they are intricately linked in some way, and we wanted to find out how. So
the reason for British architecture is because it's the archive we were working with. We were living in London at the time, and that's the archive we had access to.
And style is based on location, even today, even with global media today. So we built this archives, looking at pictures, looking at the archives. The RBA archive in England is the biggest architectural archive in the world, and built these spreadsheets. Whole project basically is, in a sense, kind of code, where we wanted to find out things like, okay, so this architect lived at this time. What did this architect do in terms of buildings? Did they have a library? Did they travel? So they built in this style. Would they have seen buildings like that, or did it rely on libraries? Did they inherit a library from someone else? So we organized in this way. We like looked at mass media hardware. So like, when was the camera invented? When was the first fax machine invented? Mass media software, which is what we call basically like a specific book or a specific software, whatever it might be. Architectural styles, architects, and then the buildings that they would have built. In the exhibition, we were very fortunate to have a lot of originals from the archive, of which one was this, which is an original hand sketch by Owen Jones for the grammar ornament. So he would have done these sketches to try to figure out how to do layouts, etc. In this case, of some floral motif. God knows where it's from. I can't remember. And the actual exhibition itself looked like this. It was in the gallery at the RABA, where there was a big physical model made out of MDF that you could touch, you could interact with it, and it stood on this huge digitally printed carpet. If you stood in front of the model, you saw that there's a VR headset there. There was 4 of them. If you put it on, you would have seen a film that played out. All 4 acts would have been about half an hour. And the model always stayed in the same place. So you could always relate to where you were. And everything around it would change. You see some plates from grammar ornament popping up there in the background. And the relationship between people using this headset and standing in front of the model. And the entire room we devised as a diagram of this research. So diagonally across the gallery is time. Every year is 2 centimeters in the carpet. So you could look down and read what year you're standing in, like this, from basically when the printing press was invented up and into the future. And then the other thing that you'll notice is styles. Obviously, styles doesn't exist like this.
This is the shifts in tone in the carpet mark when it is the moment in time when the start of that style is attributed. Obviously, those lines are very blurry. Okay,
and one clear thing that you can see is that the styles lasted for very long in the past.
This is not the duration, is when they begin. So it's
not
not
like you see this
may
length here.
continue longer, but just you see an acceleration of how new styles appear faster and faster and faster as we move over time.
You can see brutalism is this sliver over here. You could say that continues today potentially, but and also, yes, we see here a highlight of that, but then also these ornaments and the carpets were the kind of media that would have been around at the time. But yeah.
So how did you draw the line from one style to another?
The moment that a style originates. So when another style originates, we put it on top.
Okay.
So it's like,
Okay.
yeah, it's the moment when they start.
Yeah.
We wanted to create a graphic that is, yeah, it can be misleading, but that's because we could see that acceleration of the starting of the styles. We wanted to portray that also in that carpet. So it's when they begin,
Okay.
but they might continue under.
Like layer up.
Yeah.
But
I wish
yeah.
that we could see that overlay, but then clarity versus complexity.
Yeah.
But it's, thanks for asking me.
Symbolism.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Stuff.
So in the carpet, you could look down, and you were also then standing on, a TV or a Game Boy or a VR headset or a printing press, depending on what time you would have been in. Here we are for scale, being silly. And so this film, which again also is using Unreal Engine, we will bring this actual file later so we can see how, when we get closer to making films, etc., like how did we actually devise this world to make these films?
The workflow is the same as you would use, so that's why we wanted to bring up this as well. The same workflow that you would follow in Unreal, if you want.
So like Act 1, we get introduced to Sergio's book. There's always a little guide, a little figure that speaks to you, that walks around the model in the same scale as the model, and opens the book for you, very kind of didactic was supposed to be. But then we make little snapshots throughout history, like this example where we can see that the two towers that are there in the model, they are the towers of St. Paul's Cathedral, built by Christopher Wren, who was an architect in the UK at the time, who right after the fire of London in 1666, when basically the whole city burned down, he built over 50 churches in the city of London, and most of them in a style that he had never seen. So he's like one of the first mass media architects in the sense where like he was extremely wealthy, like one of the wealthiest people in the country. He was the head of the Royal Society, he was a chemist and all these things, and he had a vast library, and he would just have shipments of books and manuscripts, mainly from France, arriving. And he went to Paris once. He would have seen some Baroque buildings that would have inspired him. But basically, all of the buildings he built would have arrived to him through mass media, early mass media work. And that's basically, you go to London today and look around, basically all that you see, you can think about it like that. These ideas for this architecture came to someone through media. Then we talk about moments when books start to be translated. We spoke earlier about this writer Campbell, who's also an architect, who was this big Palladian architect in the UK, and he wrote books about Palladio and translated Palladio's books that at this time would have reached the United States, where President Jefferson were reading them and made them into the holy grail of how to build Washington, D.C. So basically the link here goes all the way back past Semper and past the polychromy idea of Greek architecture. So this was an original we had in the exhibition. Then obviously we talk about the moment when colonial empires like Britain would have traveled around the world to find ideas. This is an example of Chambers, who, as Lara mentioned, actually went to China several times. So a lot of these early ideas for whenever you see a kind of, even throughout Europe, early Chinese or Chinoiserie buildings, they would have come through his sketches and his ideas, including the pagoda at Kew Gardens that Lara mentioned earlier. So we continued looking at like how buildings and ideas of buildings travel through other mediums. So then we start looking at photography, the first moment where you could see like a photograph of an actual building. Like it's interesting to just think about the mind fuck it must have been to like, this is the real thing that I'm holding in my hand right now. Like it just would have never happened before. And it also created these things like the early stereoscopes, the first kind of VR devices, where you would have taken a photograph at exactly the same time, two cameras at the same width of the distance between our eyes, put that in a little device you hold up against your head, and you could see that in 3D. And these devices became like the most popular thing in Victorian England. Like people would have these custom built furniture just to keep the photographs, and they would pay shitloads of money to pay people to go on these colonial ships and go around the world and photograph stuff so we can come back and look at them at our tea parties here in London. Later we speak about the TV, and when ideas of spaces we saw in the TV, including like TV studios, started becoming very inspirational. So you would have seen like the interior of a TV studio in the 70s and be like, maybe we could have that in our living room or in our office, or and then, of course, the moment when the first interactable virtual worlds, like the first video games, start to kind of enter the homes, and how the styles of these things don't directly relate to how we build environments in the physical world, but the style of this and the colors start to have an impact. Then towards the end of the film, we speak about Pinterest, that we actually think is one of these kinds of tools that similarly, like you might hear an architect say, like, my architecture has no style. They're like, that's slightly suspicious. Similarly, we always say that if someone says that you're not allowed to use Pinterest, or the Pinterest is for like wedding planning, whatever, be suspicious, because it's actually one of the most revolutionary tools for the spreading of ideas through visual means, largely because of this more like this button at the top, where you can search for visual information with visual information. So like, I like this image, I want to see more of that. And we argue that like, I mean, often, maybe you've heard it, like you go into a kind of hipster specialty coffee bar, whatever, in the 7th district. And the reason why it looks the way it looks is because of Pinterest. And like you go around the world, it's like, how in the world does this coffee shop that's owned by different people in Bangkok look exactly the same as a coffee shop in Chicago?
Because of Pinterest.
Because of it.
And I don't have a problem with things not being original. I actually think that is a fallacy to even have that notion. I don't have a problem with the tool. And I don't have a problem with anything that you will do. You're free to do whatever you want to do. The only thing, like, we don't want to scare you with all these things that we are talking about. But we just want you to know where these things have come from, what they have encoded, the motives, conscious and unconscious motives for doing things, motives. I have difficulty with that word in English. The motive for using something, and that you perhaps with some of the things we say inspire you to reflect upon your work. I am not sure if us doing this long 3-year-long project called Freestyle, and then we did the online version of it, I am not sure if we're doing that we are raising awareness of certain issues, or we are perpetuating problematic practices. I am also conflicted about my own work, but I still do it, but I reflect on it. So all we want is reflection. We are not gonna find the right or the wrong way, but if we learn, and if we look, and if we are ready to reflect, I would be incredibly happy about that, and I think I can speak for all of us in that sense. So
Pinterest is probably also maybe the tool within these. I mean, for me, within my work that I use the most. Probably have it open on a different screen constantly. And at the end of this project, Freestyle, we wrote a little text that's included in the last chapter. That's where we say that in the future, maybe we're saying like middle of the 21st century, 2050, maybe, or something like this, we will have architecture at the speed of the spoken word. And in this case, we're talking about media and automation of ideas and automation of spreading of ideas about architecture. And this highly speculative idea was that maybe in the future, there will be an AI tool where you can say what you want and it just gives it to you. And we were like, maybe in the future, this will exist in some way or form. And we were speculating that if you're wearing some kind of headset, you would be like, what about a sofa there? What about a Harry Potter world? What about now Star Wars ships comes in and you're walking around in it? And now it seems like we're all basically almost there already. So we're kind of tying this together with examples of automations within architecture that I think we should always be aware of and be aware when we're using a tool that is automated in some way or form. We've looked at these before, like Revit blocks or blocks within different softwares, or when we download things that are actually meant for construction, or when we're using something like an AI tool, which increasingly architectural offices are doing. This is an example of a very, very interesting company that's started by an alumni of this studio called Fenestra, which basically allows you to make a quick sketch of a building and it gives you a rendering. Or you give it a rendering, but you want a sketch. Or you give it a sketch and you want a fully automated fly-through, or you want a 3D model that you can 3D print, whatever. And in this case, this architect has developed a tool that will allow other people to do this. And I think this is so early that we don't really have a judgment or a way to think about what this does to our creative abilities, in the sense we're critiquing and looking at pattern books like grammar ornament. How do we even begin to talk about this? Obviously, this is not buildings, but different prompts for different styles. It's the same subject done in various different styles. This becomes somehow like the cornerstone of all of this AI tools. And it's hard to see here, but you can look at the slides later where someone did this quite elaborate test looking at all of the different AI tools and how good it is at simulating different styles or different kinds of architecture, specifically for architects to use it as a tool within their practice.
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to conclude this before we move to the next slide, that the technique and the resources, it's very important that you understand what are the processes and the resources behind tools that you use, because we are more and more separated. from that. So that is something to be very aware of. And the one thing, no, like the only way in which, in this case, we're speaking specifically about AI, but any kinds of libraries are created is through sets of data. No, sets of data are catalogs, no different than the pattern books that we were looking at. And what happens when you open a pattern book that is a catalog? In that catalog, one would ideally be able to trace where those references are coming from, right? As we said, in the pattern books, there was a lot of making up things, a lot of fantasy, but there was still at least that trace. The metadata was in there. This is coming from this part of the world or that part of the world. That is what happens with the data sets that go into AI is that what we receive is the end, and we rarely interact with the data set, right? So the system is perpetuated. The data that goes into it, we don't necessarily access that, or we are not aware of that. And that's perhaps where something that I wanted to point out, because perhaps that is where we see a problem and why sometimes we're just baffled by things that AI churns out.
And obviously there are ways that maybe throughout the semester we'll talk about examples that are happening now that are not necessarily related to architecture or the style of architecture, but we're certainly in a moment when we look back at Pugin, where today this kind of use of the spreading of ideas are completely soaked in ideologies and in moralistic ideas of society, like the very basic idea of certain AI tools that are being called too woke, for instance. What the hell does that even mean? And they literally they attempt to rewrite it to give you different prompts based on like maybe a similar level of kind of criticality as something you say, anything that's not Christian is bad, so don't do that, you know. And then we get the Mecha Hitler or whatever it was from this AI tools. Yeah.
So whether, I mean, I think it's important to think about that maybe the conflict that one has, when you're looking at an AI tool that has a set that you don't know where it's coming from, is that you are not engaging with the data sets behind it, and that blindness is what creates perhaps some of the issues that you might be encountering. And why we are not talking so much specifically about AI and we're focusing so much more on asset libraries is because we want to talk about the sets of data. We don't necessarily want to talk about the process. And the process is incredibly open. So as we said, if some of you want to use AI tools, do so, but we want you to know everything about the process. And you may use very different kinds of processes for this project. And we ask you to document those. So the process is what's very, very important to understand, okay? And how reflection and self-evaluation comes from that process. So just to conclude, a few notions that I didn't want to overwhelm with so much today, but that are going to be coming up and that are more technical. What is an asset library and what is it composed of? Based on the design, on the software tools that we're going to be using, an asset library is composed of 3D geometry, materials and textures, of very lighting presets. Okay, so often you have a lighting preset which can be an HDRI or a certain lighting digital rig. And that is very important for setting the style or the mood of that world. There can also be audio. I don't know if you're going to use that. I did like the other two, it's good that you're aware of animations or rig characters and also blueprints and prefabs, the way that things interact with one another. You can have rules embedded in your asset library. Okay? And each item is usually embedded with some kind of metadata or tags. And this allows you to retrieve things. It allows you to search for them. So when you look at existing asset libraries, they will have a lot of that metadata. And there is actually something that could potentially be very positive. And I hope someone picks up this notion of the metadata and start loading your digital assets with metadata that you want them to exist with. In a way, that is our ability to embed, encode information in digital content so that someone who wants to might be able to access it later. Then how an asset library actually works, just to run through an example. And the next slide, please. And you can look at this later, but it's stored in a browser. So we put it in a catalog. Then it is referenced. So software like Unreal Engine is basically calling the original. Even if you are putting from you open Unreal and then you have a catalog and then you say like this object, I want it to be here. That data is always being pulled from the original asset. And this basically optimizes the process of rendering. Why am I talking about these complicated technical things? Is because I think the system for this way of doing software, to me, somehow is established in the 19th century when we start doing these catalog books. So through instancing, that is basically like copying or repeating one thing, basically an industrial 19th century process, we are optimizing the way in which the computer can show us things that look more realistic. There is also things that you will encounter, I think, like procedural population, where you are like, we have all these different objects, populate this area with them with a bit of variation. That is how you do forests, but it could be also how you do other things if you want to think creatively about it. And then versioning and sharing, no? So the way you create these big asset libraries is by creating versions of certain objects. And these can also be, this is a logic that can also go into code and therefore into optimization. Lastly, the notion of real-time rendering. I mean, it's funny because maybe some of you are coming to these tools currently, and those, the old people always talking about like, when we started doing renders, it was so hard and it would take so long. That maybe for you the notion of real-time rendering is not so surprising, but I think it's interesting to understand because again, the real-time rendering cannot exist without the catalog, and it cannot exist without techniques that go from simulation to approximation. So when we started doing renderings, everything was trying to be a simulation. What we have now is approximations. And just, this is really the second to last slide. So if you bear with me with this notion, renders used to be done through calculating the way that light bounces through materials. So someone would go and like someone who understood physics would basically calculate the way in which light bounces through this material and write code for it. And then you would put it into your machine. You would say, we have these surfaces that are mathematically described in the 3D geometric software. And then we have sun coming in this direction, calculate, and the ray would start to bounce. And that's why it would take so long, right? Now we have all of these other techniques that are building an approximation of that reality without doing the calculation. And even though the results might look very, very similar, I think understanding that at the core, they are a completely different thing, to me is important. And that's the more we work with approximations because they are faster, the more we're going away from, let's say, the source material. And again, I don't have a problem with that either. I just want you to know it. So you will hear things such as PBR shading models, and that's a way of encoding materials so that they speak to the rendering engine in a way that is more efficient. And what PBR used to be embedded into this simulation and the very raw calculation of how light travels through space, now actually they have embedded in them approximations. And the more that there is AI, the more it is actually an approximation. And level of detail, for example, which is a term you might use, has to do with the way we perceive these worlds, no? So if a model is very close to us, it will have very high level of detail, but we usually create 5 versions of that model, and the 5th one looks like a potato. But when it's really far away, you read it as the object because, going back, pattern recognition. The rendering software is relying on the fact that we are going to do that interpretation for it. The fact that a lot of that world is built in your head. And this to me is quite fascinating. is good and it's bad at the same time, and that's for you to also think about. But yeah, we wrote down their believability over truth. And again, do we even use the word truth? I do not know. So to conclude, a couple of statements, I think, to reinstate also things that I think Anusha was saying, or to saying them in different ways, or maybe they're not even the same things. But the problem is not only the catalog, but who writes it and what values does it carry. And if it's traceable, and we could add a bunch of points over there. If pattern books were the catalogs of empire, asset libraries are the catalogs of platforms, neo-imperial platforms. I don't know, what do we call them? What are these tools? And that hegemony is basically like when you have concentrations of power and willingness submission to that power, also works through form. Okay. And that the more seamless the system, the easier it is to forget the values within it. So again, not to make you frightened, but these are just only calls for reflection. We finished there.
Yeah, went slightly. And also steamrolled a bit, didn't really leave so much room for questions or, but obviously there'll be a chance to discuss this, and it's not the only lecture of the semester, but maybe if there are any initial questions or things that you're curious about to talk about together.
But they're also going into talking about the smaller group as well.
Okay. Yeah.
I have many questions, but I just posed one of them, which came up while you were having this really great lecture. And the question is, like, if you would say that modular building yields a certain kind of architectural style, or there's a history of that, would you say that using an asset library is free of that, or is the use of the asset library yielding also a certain kind of compositional style we will be able to read? In the way you put them together, or the way you populate environments.
Well, the other option is like a modular building, as in like.
That's just the analogy to it.
Yeah.
Because I would say that modularity can be read in buildings, but obviously we're not doing buildings, we're doing an environment. And I would just say, is the use of the pre-made assets yielding something, or is it free of that? I'm just curious. It's a thing that I had in my head.
If it's free of modular of repetition.
If it's free of a preconceived.
No. Impossible, no? Unless, I mean, but it is free. You can never be free from prejudice, if maybe that's no. But you can reflect on it, and in doing so, maybe you free yourself from some of that prejudice, or you make better choices. But that, whether you are doing things through modules or not. The reason why here we're building something through modular logic is because the software will not allow you to do it in any other way. It's impossible to build virtual worlds without considering the asset library. And because of that, I find that link then is very interesting to understand where does even this logic come from? Where did we inherit it from?
It also connects to something that we will be talking about a bit, but not maybe in such great detail. So obviously you're building a virtual asset library. We're not asking you to go to OBI, buy bricks or whatever you can find, right? And put them together and see what you can do with them. And the fact that your library where you can pull from, you can use AI tools, basically like the possibilities for what these assets are is almost endless. Which obviously in parallel to what physical architecture is like increasingly, it's almost the parallel opposite. Because with all of these things where we spoke about with the ability to make a plastic cast or to buy the same ornaments 1,000 times, or this is only perpetuated, and also the fact that these styles for various reasons variations of styles have kind of decreased in popularity in architecture. Means that our options for what we build physically are diminishing rapidly at the same time. You know, there's standardization where basically, yeah, you can print things on aluminum panels, still an aluminum panel, which also then means that the style of buildings that we actually build in the physical world are not only by choice more and more the same. But obviously in your case, you're building a virtual asset library, so your options are vastly different.
We leave it here.
Okay, thanks everyone. So we take a little break and then we come back and there's a workshop on your initial asset library. And then just a reminder for next week, have a look again at what you are required to bring, because there's a pinup and there's some printing involved again, and we let you look at what that is.
Next week.
Yeah. Which is in the slideshow as
10
well.
minutes?
Okay.
What time?
Yeah.
So 10 minutes.
Shall we come back in 10 minutes? And we thought the three of us would break with our groups. I think maybe